Well, hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be with you all today. Let me start off by saying that as a trained psychologist, I really shouldn't talk about me. Let me ask you a couple of questions about you first, okay? So let's start with this one. If you were a cheese, what kind of cheese would you be?
Cheddar.
If you lived at Hogwarts, which house do you think would best fit your personality? Let me ask you this. If you were a character in the SpongeBob SquarePants universe, what SpongeBob quote best represents your essence, do you think? So why am I asking you all these questions? Well, some of you know the answers. Many of you probably don't. There's really good news here. You could find out the answers for free online. Does anybody know where? BuzzFeed, of course, BuzzFeed. Hundreds, if not thousands, of psychological profiles and personality profiles are available to you these days on BuzzFeed. My oldest son told me today he found out that his percent Billie Eilish is 100, which I thought, well, there's a problem there because you're not Billie Eilish, right? And my youngest son said he found out today, or a few days ago, that he's 0% Baby Yoda. So you can find out amazing things about yourself, can't you, for free online at BuzzFeed. So why am I starting there? Well, I'm starting there because these assessments have become incredibly popular, right? They're so appealing. They connect you somehow to the world at large, but also make you feel special about yourself. There's something incredible about these free psychological profiles. But they exist in a much larger context. They exist in a world called psychometrics. Psychometrics, put really simply, is the measurement of mental capacity and mental processes. So what's a really common, really familiar psychometric instrument you've probably all heard of? Well, the IQ test, the intelligence quotient test. Another psychometric many of you in the audience probably know, the SAT. Another psychometric, the Myers-Briggs type inventory. And that's really where I'm going to focus today, is those psychometric instruments, those tools that measure those soft things, those things that are really hard to describe and potentially even have conversations about: personality, motivators, values, those things that we're inherently interested in. BuzzFeed gets this, right? There are more and more quizzes appearing on BuzzFeed every day. But there are actually real, valid, reputable psychological instruments that can test actual personality traits and can actually be really helpful in your life, your career, your relationships, both personal and professional, decisions that you want to make in your life right now. There are tools available to you that can help you well beyond the world of BuzzFeed. So I think of it as missing pieces to the puzzle of you. No psychometric is ever going to be perfect. We're all unique people, but there are certain patterns of behavior that are predictable and that do repeat, and we can understand those things. This is a sample of what some psychological profiles look like, just 3, but it gives you an idea of what a real tool will produce for you, as opposed to, again, what percentage Baby Yoda are you? Or there was another BuzzFeed quiz that said, who is your ideal soulmate celebrity over 40? I don't know if you want to really change your life based on that information or that data, but I would say you may want to think about how this kind of data can really impact your life in lots of different ways. So my first exposure to psychometrics was in graduate school. I was getting my doctorate in clinical psychology, and the task was to create a profile, write a narrative of this patient who I didn't get to meet, I didn't get to interview, I knew nothing about their family history, I knew nothing about their work history or relationships. I just had a stack of psychometric data. So these were results from personality profiles and all sorts of other profiles. I was fairly skeptical at the time. Is this really going to generate a narrative, a profile of a living, breathing human being, just a bunch of numbers and scales? So that was a long time ago for me, but jump 10 years forward from there, and I found myself working at a large insurance company. My interests had shifted from clinical work to organizational psychology. And for those of you that don't know what organizational psychology is, I will tell you, I don't help people figure out how to organize their closets or their drawers. It's really the psychology of organizations and how organizations function and how people work in organizations. So here I was at this large insurance company, suddenly testing very successful salespeople. Salespeople that sold life insurance, they sold disability insurance, they helped people in incredible ways. And these top salespeople had made a lot of money for the company and for themselves. They were at a point in their career when they were trying to figure out, well, do I want to be a sales manager? Do I want to be a sales leader? Is that the next step for me? And as you could imagine, you don't necessarily want to put somebody in that kind of position who's going to flame out, who's going to derail, who's going to lose a lot of employees because of certain personality traits or certain character styles. And so I was tasked with finding those reputable, valid assessment tools that we could use to test very successful salespeople to determine, was it likely that they were going to be decent managers? Was it likely they were going to be good sales leaders in the future? And so that's what we did. And we got wonderful data that compared them to successful sales leaders and sales managers, not only around the US, but also around the world. There was one person in particular that I worked with that I want to mention. And the reason I want to mention him was, again, had done very, very well up until this point as a sales professional, very ambitious person, and his test results came back. They were amazing. Ambitious, driven, strategic thinking, level-headed, not impulsive at all, very, very sociable. These all mapped to being a really good sales manager and a really good sales leader. But there was one scale that came back that was problematic. He had really low empathy. So what does that mean? Low empathy. In relationships, it could mean you might say things that other people take offense to a little too easily and a little too quickly. You're not able to kind of step into other people's shoes that well. You might insult people without realizing it. And as a manager, when you're trying to develop and retain employees, that's a real problem. I think the term that professional psychologists used, at least at the time for this person, was high achiever and also asshole. So this is actually where I kind of got hooked on psychometrics. And it wasn't because we could uncover assholes, because chances are people in his life kind of already knew that about him. It was because he completed these questionnaires on his own. He answered all of these questions by himself, and the test spit back this report that I was able to present to him and say, look at the results here. So what do you see here? How do you make sense of this? What are we going to do with this information? How is it going to work for you? It wasn't a subjective, I think this is who you are. It wasn't people in his life commenting on his personal traits. It was data that was provided based on his own responses to a series of questionnaires. So as you can imagine, it's harder to refute that data, but it also enables you to really have a conversation that's constructive. And the conversation that came about after that was, maybe he needs to hire a coach to soften his style a little bit. Maybe he needs to pause a little bit more before talking or providing difficult feedback to people. Maybe he needs to find a few trusted colleagues who will kind of nudge him or kick him under the table, or who will chat with him after he said something particularly direct so he can repair some damage in a relationship that maybe he's caused. So for me, the value in these tools is they can provide incredible information for people, but because they're being self-generated, the conversations can be really, really fruitful and really, really helpful. Now, trying to understand the human mind and quantify it goes way back. So Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, we're talking about 2,500 years ago. This is the first known time when a human being tried to quantify different personality styles. And he came up with this theory of the 4 biles, or also known as the 4 temperaments. And this model actually still exists to some degree today, but what it was about was that we each have these 4 levels of liquids in our body, and out of balance, it meant that our personalities might steer in certain ways rather than kind of be a complete and balanced and kind of well person. So that was Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, but the first modern use of psychometric tools was about 100 years ago. It was World War I. The military hired psychologists, of all people, to employ personality testing for recruits. And this is an actual photo of folks taking something called the Wordsworth data sheet, a questionnaire, and the idea was they wanted to screen out folks that might have a predisposition for what we call today PTSD, what was called back then shell shock. And so they used this tool to screen those folks off the battlefield. We didn't want to lose them to shell shock, and the Army, honestly, didn't want to have to pay the very expensive treatment and long-term care for these folks after they came back off the field. And so that's the first example of kind of modern psychometrics being used. The really good news is, though, in the past 100 years, there's been a really clear line that's developed between tools that measure psychiatric illness, psychiatric disorders, mental illness, and what we call normal personality or kind of everyday behaviors. And I just want to show you real quickly 3 different models that are incredibly common. They're used in schools, they're used in corporations, and they measure traits and styles that we can't see, but we can understand and use to predict behavior. The 5-factor model you may have heard of, also known as the Big Five, incredibly popular and common, and these are the 5 traits that it measures. Something called the Holland theory of career interest is something that's been used for years on high school campuses and on college campuses to help people determine potential career fit with different roles and different professions. And then lastly, the most recent development in psychometrics, or one of the most recent developments, is emotional intelligence. Now, EQ, or emotional intelligence, has been shown to be more predictive of life satisfaction and life success than IQ, believe it or not. So EQ trumps IQ. And we can actually measure somebody's EQ, and they can, believe it or not, work on their EQ skills. So just 3 examples of some kind of underlying models of psychometrics today that are used in all sorts of parts of different people's lives. So some concrete examples. Think about a relationship that you're in, a relationship that you've been in. Think about moving in with that person, maybe marrying that person. Wouldn't it be amazing to have an instruction manual for who they are? Wouldn't it be great to have a report that says, okay, there are some things that you know about this person, maybe you don't know this about this person as well, but to also have a report that lays out a language where you and your partner can really compare who you are. Things like, okay, I'm more conscientious than you, so when it comes to tax time, I'm probably going to be more on top of that than you. That's the example of a married couple, I suppose. Or let's talk about sociability. My partner is more sociable than me, so what does that really mean? Well, it means I'm going to maybe want to stay home more than they will, but I'm going to know that that's going to really fuel them, and that's going to be something that they find very satisfying. So not only having that data, but then also being able to really just have those conversations early on in a relationship can be incredibly fruitful. I've done a lot of work with family businesses, but as you can imagine, even families going through some kind of psychometric process can help understand how different members of a family are different. Think about a father who's very stability-oriented, long-term oriented, don't rock the boat, slow to change, and a daughter who is very ambitious, driven, craves stimulation, and craves change. Well, they're going to be locked in conflict, aren't they, throughout not only her teenage years, but beyond. And this is actually an example of some clients that I did work with. But once you lay out the psychometrics for somebody, once you say, it's not about good and bad, it's not about who's right and wrong, it's just about you two are wired incredibly differently. And what does that do for that relationship? It does a couple of amazing things. It helps each person understand the other one better. It helps avoid conflict. And I would argue it helps people, especially in families, kind of appreciate those differences instead of going to war over them. Now, colleges have been using psychometric tools for years as well. In career searches, for sure. So if you go to a career counseling center, chances are you have access to something called the Strong Interest Inventory, and that's a career assessment tool. But colleges have also started using assessment tools with first-year roommates. Makes sense, right? Help them understand each other a little bit more, avoid tension, avoid conflict, but have a conversation early on about ways in which you're different. Professional sports teams have used them to help understand who their athletes are, what their personality strengths and weaknesses are, and then also how to put teams together. But it doesn't have to be a sports team for psychometrics to really be valuable. Psychometrics can be valuable in any team and in any group where people are working towards a common goal. I want to tell you about a specific area of my work that I just really enjoy, and it relates to the use of psychometrics in teams. For the past several years, I've been a judge at a business case competition in Vermont. So for those of you who don't know about case competitions, teams of 3 or 4 students from universities all around the country or all around the world will converge on a host university for a day or a few days or a week, and they have to, in this competition, analyze business cases, understand what's going on in the business, and these are generally written cases, come up with what their questions are, come up with an analysis, and then they have to present it to a panel of judges in a matter of hours, generally. Now, what's amazing about this is these teams of students often don't know each other. They were put together because the university said, oh, these are great students, and we think they will represent our university well. But within the course of a month, they're prepping for a case competition, which is an incredibly high-stress environment, and they've barely met. So this past December, I worked with a team in Panama, and 3 people, exactly that situation. They had never met before. 2 of them had been in a class but didn't do any projects together. And here they were about to prep for this international case competition in Vermont, and they didn't know each other. So you can imagine the stress that goes into that. Very quickly, they have to kind of come together and figure out how to work together. So I put them through a psychometric instrument. You may know this instrument that's on the slide right now, the DISC profile. It's a behavioral style profile. Now, these aren't their results, but this is what it looks like when you plot a team or a group on the DISC. And you can have conversations about, again, ways in which people are the same, ways in which people are different. In this particular case, for this case competition team, one of the students, very exuberant, vivacious, articulate. We talked about her being kind of the person to lead off the presentation to the judges. Somebody else, much more analytical, she was going to be the person to do the case analysis and present a very thorough, very comprehensive analysis of a case. And then the third person, he was much more of a kind of stable, don't rock the boat, kind of like the father I was talking about earlier. And he was kind of the hub for the group. He really helped to make sure they stayed on target, on task, on time, and those were the roles that they decided to take on based on what the data said. The data resonated with how they saw themselves and were able to very early on have a conversation about how they can use it to their best interest. And this is them accepting their award a few weeks ago in Vermont, at the University of Vermont Grossman School of Business, 3 students in the middle. They came in first place. Now, moving forward, psychometrics has a lot that I'm excited about, some of which is just the impact of big data on being able to crunch all sorts of variables in terms of understanding who people are. But also, probably in the near future, we're going to see companies that don't ask you to fill out questionnaires, but just using AI monitor you with some kind of camera, watch your response to either verbal stimuli or visual stimuli, and see what your hands do, see what your expressions are on your face, and then generate personality profiles based on that information. There's also a movement towards what they call the gamification of psychological assessment, which is, again, you're not filling out questionnaires anymore about yourself, you're participating in a video game. And so the science behind that is really tracking how you're going through that game, what decisions you're making, how quickly you're moving, whether it's a virtual reality environment or a more traditional video game. So those are some of the things that are right on the horizon, and some companies have already started experimenting with these alternate ways of gathering this data. So pretty exciting stuff. But I think it's important, before jumping ahead to the future and before thinking about how potentially every job that you apply for is going to have some kind of AI-based screening tool that you'll have to submit yourself to, thinking about right now in your life. From all the examples that I gave you, are you a member of a team? Are you a member of a group? Are you in a relationship, personal or professional? Are you wondering about your own kind of career decisions and life path? Are you going through some kind of transition where really taking a step back and just thinking about who you are, how you're wired, what your values are, where that could really be valuable to you? So I'd really like to leave you with that today. The field of psychometrics is never going to be 100% precise. It's always going to be evolving. Human beings are far too complex for us to be able to say, we can put all of your information in a report. But I really do encourage you to think about valid, reputable psychometrics as being able to impact your life in a really positive way today. Now, it would be remiss of me if I did not leave you with some additional information. We've talked a lot about various tools. We've talked a lot about applications, but what I think probably you're most interested in is the following, which is I would be American cheese, I would live in Ravenclaw, and as it turns out, the SpongeBob quote that best represents who I am is, you don't need a license to drive a sandwich. Thank you all very much for your time.